Chapter-4, Authority. We have seen that before taking up the quest of the real self, whereby we shall become free from bondage to desire and fear, we have to prepare ourselves for it by revising our ideas and casting off those that are at all likely to hamper the pursuit of the quest. This revision of our present ideas as a preparation for the true quest is called philosophy. But philosophy is not an end in itself, not a means. But there are philosophies and philosophers. Unless it is of the right kind, it will, instead of leading us to the quest, actually lead us deeper into ignorance that is the cause of all our ills. The right kind of philosophy is an impartial criticism of all our present notions about the three things, the world, the soul, and God. Those philosophies whose aim is to confirm these notions are inimical to success in the quest. They are to be avoided. Philosophy, therefore, to be really helpful, must begin with a recognition of the primary ignorance that is pointed out in the foregoing chapter. This means that all our present ideas are suspect, for the reason given by the sage and explained. They must be subjected to a thorough criticism and replaced by other ideas which shall be unobjectionable and helpful to the quest. In the course of this criticism, we shall need to consider the evidence for or against the validity of our ideas. But the evidence we are to rely upon must be of the right kind. What is the right kind of evidence? Is it the common experience of men? That experience is the outcome of the primary ignorance. And to rely on such evidence would only result in giving the stump of philosophical truth to the ideas we criticize. We require evidence of a different kind. We can now understand how it happens that philosophy has earned a name for futility. It is undeniable that philosophies, as a rule, failed to give us any real help in solving the riddle of life. This has been particularly so in the West. This failure was evidently due to their use of evidence of the wrong kind. They used as evidence the common experience of mankind, which, as we have seen, is bad as being the offspring of our ignorance. And they used this wrong kind of evidence because they began their philosophies without a recognition of this ignorance. Naturally, they arrived at conclusions which confirmed that ignorance and barred the way to deliverance or self-realization. Some tell us that the body is the self. Others say that the mind is the self. Both agree in asserting that the world is real and that the self is an individual, one of a vast multitude of selves. Some there are who admit that the self is neither the body nor the mind as we know it, but imagine that there is a superior kind of mind which is the real self. All these views agree in making it out that the self is finite. But finiteness is the cause of bondage. If, as these philosophers say, the self is really finite in its very nature, then we must bid goodbye to all hope of becoming free. Thus, there is no vital difference among these views. These philosophies cannot at all help us in getting rid of our primary ignorance. He that would philosophize aright must avoid the mistakes of these philosophers. He must choose his evidence correctly. He must seek and find evidence of experience which is not the outcome of the ignorance. Reliable evidence, therefore, is not the experience of ignorant men, but that of the sages, who are wholly free from this ignorance. Only on the basis of their experience can we build up a philosophy that would relax the grip that this ignorance now has on us, and thus make it possible for us to start on the quest and pursue it to the very end, so that we may win similar experience for ourselves. That the truth cannot be reached without evidence other than the experience of common humanity was felt by Professor James of America. He sought to supply that need to the best of his power in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. In that book, he made free use of the contents of another book, namely Cosmic Consciousness by a Dr. Buck. The evidence gathered into these books is that of exceptional men. But all this evidence has been treated uncritically, because the authors had no clear notion of the primary ignorance. There are at least 3 classes of exceptional men, and all of them are not of the same grade. That is to say, those who have given evidence of exceptional experiences belong to one of these 3 classes: the yogis, saints, and sages. We need to discriminate among them and find out which of these are the proper witnesses in our inquiry. The evidence of the yogis is unreliable because they have not transcended the realm of ignorance. This is seen in the fact that they differ among themselves. The same is the case with most saints. The sages do not differ among themselves because they have transcended the ignorance. No sage ever contradicts another sage. Revelation tells us that all sages are one. We shall be able to recognize the correctness of this teaching later on. As between the so-called yogis and so-called saints, the saints are far more worthy to be followed than the yogis, especially the hatha yogis, though we need to discriminate between saint and true saint, because as we shall see on the chapter about devotion, their views differ according to the degree of their ripeness. The nearer they are to sagehood, the wiser are their utterances. And there are saints whose utterances are of a mischievous tendency. We also find that the saints have moods, or rather that moods have them, which is not the case with the sages. The experiences of the yogis are highly complex, and therefore their descriptions have an irresistible fascination for us. But the fact is, they are not even conscious of the empire that the ignorance has over them. Their goal is not the ending of the ignorance, but the attainment, within the realm of the ignorance, of a glorious status that seems to them worthy of being striven for. They are persuaded that the mind itself is the self, and this is the case even when they deny it. They believe in a blissful existence in which the mind shall survive, though infinitely glorified and endowed with wonderful powers. This they consider to be the highest possible gain. Some of them are more ambitious still. They hope to be able, after winning these powers, which they wrongly call deliverance, to obtain control over the world and then to change it beyond recognition, to erect a tangible heaven on earth. The saints are free from these ambitions. That neither the hatha yogis or the saints can have a right vision of the truth was clearly pointed out by the sage Sankara. In his Vivekachudamani, in verse 365, he tells us that the vision of the truth obtained by non-sages is apt to be distorted by the interference of the mind, which is not the case with the true sage. According to the sages, this glorified mind of the hatha yogis is but a body of a subtler kind. The notion that this is the self is simply the primary ignorance in a more dangerous form. The common man is in fact in a much better state than the hatha yogi, For the latter has only gone deeper into the ignorance and postponed the day of deliverance. With all due respect, therefore, to the Hatha yogis, we must reject their evidence. The saints as a class are worthy of reverence, but for the present we must put on one side their evidence also, and build up our philosophy on the evidence of the sages alone. But after we shall have done this, we may take up the evidence of the saints and make a study of it in light of the teachings of the sages, though some saints are also sages. This study has a great value for us, as we shall see in due course. There have been sages in every age down to the present. Their testimony has come down to us enshrined in certain books called Upanishads or Vedantas, the Vedas. There are many passages in the books which carry conviction straight to the heart. In fact, it is the heart of all life, the real self, that speaks to us in them. The student is thus simultaneously aware of two things: that the teaching is true and that the teacher is a sage. But there can be no doubt that the earnest disciple would prefer these books, the words of a living sage, if he can find one. There can be honest doubt about the genuineness of the text of the ancient revelation, but we can have none whatever of the genuineness of the teachings of a living sage. And we are on much stronger ground if the sage has himself written down his teachings. There is also this further advantage. If we happen to be in doubt about the correct meaning of any passage, we can apply to the best possible commentator, namely the giver of the revelation, the sage himself. The disciples of the sage of Arunachala are therefore in a much better position than those that rely on older books or on pandits who have studied those books. The sage has written down his teachings and has himself explained the meaning of some of the passages. He has also given oral answers to a great many questions that have been put to him from time to time, and these answers have been recorded fairly accurately by disciples. Of course, apart from these considerations, it is a great thing to attach oneself to a living sage, as the older revelation tells us. Those that fail to do so are losing a great chance. It is not possible for a teacher who is not a sage, who is just a pandit and nothing more than a scholar, to understand the spirit of the ancient revelation. Still less is it possible for him to rouse the spiritual energies that are latent in the disciple, for the reason that he himself has not had them roused. It is necessary that the guru or master that is to teach us should himself be the embodiment of that wisdom which he is to impart to us. The teaching of our sage, Bhagavan Ramana, is therefore for us the new revelation. And for the reasons pointed out, this revelation is the most authoritative for us. We should take it as the chief basis of our philosophy, and utilize the older revelation also, insofar as it may serve to explain or complete the teaching. There is, of course, the unexpressed view of orthodox pandits, the scholars, namely, that the ancient revelation is the primary authority, and that the words of a living sage are authoritative only as echoes of that revelation. We shall come to this view later on. Just now we shall seek to obtain a clear and rational notion of what is known as authority. True authority is just the testimony of the sages, giving us an idea of their own experience of the true self, transcending the ignorance. It is called authority because it is the only reliable evidence we can have about the true self and the state of deliverance, so long as we ourselves are subject to that ignorance. There is an apparent conflict between authority and reason. A European student of philosophy who for some years sat at the feet of the sage once remarked to the sage that, as history shows, this is the age of reason, and hence it is necessary that the teaching we shall listen to and accept must be in accordance with reason. And Bhagavan replied as follows: "Whose is the intellect?" You must answer, "My intellect." So the intellect is your tool. You use it for measuring variety. It is not yourself, nor is it something independent of yourself. You are the abiding reality, while the intellect is just a phenomenon. You must find and get hold of yourself. There is no intellect in dreamless sleep. There is none in a child. The intellect develops with age. But how could there be any development or manifestation of the intellect without the seed of it in sleep or childhood? Why go to history to discover the fundamental fact? The degree of truth in history is the same as the degree of truth in the historian. We may put it this way: the usefulness of the intellect is limited by its origin, namely the primary ignorance. To those that are unaware of their subjection to this ignorance, and to those also who are content to remain in subjection to it, the intellect is a good enough tool for all their purposes. That is to say, it is an excellent tool in the service of that ignorance. But for the purpose of transcending ignorance, it is of little use. The utmost that the intellect can do for us is to recognize its own limitations and cease to hinder our quest of the truth. This it can do as soon as it begins to realize the fact of its own tainted origin and of the necessity of relying on the evidence of the sages as a step in the aid of the quest, by which an authentic revelation of the true self can be won. Thus the conflict between reason and revelation is only apparent. Our reliance on the testimony of the sages is not unreasonable, also because such reliance is only tentative. The sages tell us about the real self and the way to obtaining the direct experience of that self. Not that we may blindly believe whatever they tell us, but that we may verify their teaching by our own experience of the truth of the self. The essential part of their teaching is not what they tell us about the state of deliverance or the true nature of the self, but what they tell us about the method of winning that state. That is why this sage of Arunachala always tells the disciple, to begin with, that he must find the self by means of the quest taught by himself. Whatever else he teaches is auxiliary to the quest, and we are to accept all this teaching only tentatively, so that we may be able to take up the quest and carry it through to the point of success.